Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Season 2 of the Historians Lounge. I am your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And today I am excited to showcase today's guest on the channel. My guest today graduated from Wisconsin Lutheran College with 3 bachelor's degrees in history, communication, and English. He has applied his talents serving as an editor for international equity practitioners' publications. He has a desire to showcase meaningful content about American history and politics. As he we cannot know where we're going without understanding where we came from. And in his spare time, he works as a freelance historian, archivist, and journalist. And more information about my guest can be found on his website, which I provide the link down below. He's passionate about history, particularly American political history and the history of his hometown, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where he is a lifelong resident. And he has done numerous book reviews, including North of America, Loyalists, Indigenous Nations, and the Borders of the Long American Revolution, For People, for Country, Patrick Henry's Final Battle, A Leap of Faith in the Historical Record, The Legend of McClosk's Leap, and Spanish New Orleans and the Caribbean, and his masterly pen, A Biography of Jefferson, the Writer. So, without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause. The freelance historian, author, writer, and many more, Al Dickenson. Al, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So before we dive into today's topic, is there anything else you'd like to add about your background, Al?
Yeah, just briefly, currently I'm working as a technical writer for, we write technical manuals for how to operate machinery. But then also one of my other ventures, I have a YouTube channel that I've started myself. It's where I discuss literature, classic literature.
Ooh, okay.
So just a way of trying to figure out how we can apply the lessons of classic works of literature to our lives. So I'll send you a link and you can include it in the description below too.
Awesome. Be more than happy to do so. And speaking of your content, as I just mentioned earlier, viewers and listeners, Al has written numerous reviews of books pertaining to the early Republic era of the 13 colonies. And Al is very passionate about this era in history, which I feel doesn't get a lot of scholarship. We always look at sort of the later half of the American Revolution, or at least the beginning of the American Revolution. And I know for you all, I've had a chance to look at your website and more about your research, and I must say it is very, very incredible. I absolutely love it. And what I'm really excited to learn more from you is actually your research on the indigenous people during the early Republic period of the 13 colonies. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what drew you to that scholarship.
Yeah, I mean, a few things. I guess I kind of found a way to combine my love of, or my appreciation for early American history, like I said, the founding era and the early Republic, and then also Midwest history, which I'm a proud Wisconsin resident. And so that's one of the things that most of the Native American history that I've done has been focused on from that period and west of like the Ohio River, the Allegheny Mountains. So sort of the Western theater of the American Revolutionary War, something else that doesn't get talked about very much. Yes. And both during the early part of it and then immediately after, so like late 1780s into the 1790s and early 1800s.
Nice. And I'm actually glad we're talking about this because I'm sure you definitely agree, Al, that Native American history, especially during the early Republic period, really doesn't get a lot of scholarship in its
Yeah.
own right in terms of, the political structure, the social structure
Yep.
in connection to the early republic era. When we think of Native American history in the colonial era, we tend to think of course, the famous wars that have been associated with the colonial states and the numerous indigenous nations that fought. Some of which, probably the most iconic that's been immortalized, is the French and Indian War in the United States.
Mhm.
But I definitely feel, which you will definitely have some thoughts on, is that it goes a lot more than that. So in your research, what have you found to be the most intriguing, as well as breaking the myth about the indigenous nations during this period in America's history?
Yeah, that's a good question. What have I found the most intriguing? I guess part of it is seeing how uh, the Native Americans of the era have been sort of mythologized, in our history,
Mhm.
American history, um, and then trying to figure out why, you know, and to see them be uh, almost forgotten in a lot of ways, especially in this period of history. You talk a lot about the Colonial Army, Continental Army, and the British Army.
Right.
And certainly they're very important and deserve a lot of scholarship, but also important and vital to various aspects of the American Revolution, its success, and some of its setbacks
Right.
would have been or could be attributed to Native American nations or individual leaders. Uh, and there's a lot of really interesting history that has been forgotten and is very rarely, if ever, discussed. Uh, and so, like I said, that's probably the main thing that's so intriguing to me is the mythologizing of Native Americans, and then also the forgetfulness of historians over the last 230 years, 240 years, 50 years.
Right.
Uh, you know, and and so I think those would be the two biggest points that I would point to.
Nice. And I definitely feel like I 100% agree when we discuss the indigenous nations of the colonial era. We acknowledge them in, like, the scholarship of when we refer to the history of colonial America, like we acknowledge their, existence and their purposes, but only towards, the benefits of the colonial states, as well as the British and the French
Mhm.
who were there. But we really don't consider that the indigenous nations, especially the Iroquois Confederacy, which was one of the largest in the northern colonial stage, they were huge. And for people who don't know who the Iroquois Confederacy is, they were, some historians argue, were the basis of how the United States would later adopt their policies into their own. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that, if you've come across the Iroquois Confederacy in your research, and why they, among many others, are important to the discussion of the relations between the indigenous nations and the early republic period.
Yeah. Well, I don't do a whole lot of research with the Iroquois Confederacy in and of itself.
Okay.
Uh, but they are a vital part of early American history, like you mentioned, and to some degree, uh, the how their governmental structure was set up was similar, at least in some ways, to how the first, the Articles of Confederation were set up. Mostly, though, they were more, um, tribe based, based on how they were organized, whereas uh, and more, linguistic differences and that sort of thing, cultural
Right.
differences instead, rather than what would become the first American states, where if there were some differences, of course, between the American states, but spoke the same language, and any differences would have been probably more geographically based instead of like between North and South or the Atlantic coast and then moving in farther, rather than group identity, if that makes sense.
Definitely, definitely. And also kind of like a little change of pace, but I feel it is an important discussion. The early Republic period. Not a lot of people know what that period refers to. So, Al, if you could tell us, what is the early Republic period in America's history, and why is it important to discuss this part in our nation's history?
Yeah. So that I would describe the early Republic probably from 1760 or so until about the War 1812.
Okay.
Roughly. There could be a little bit of give and take there, but so obviously that would include the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence, Continental Congress, all the things that we are familiar with. But then it would also include a few things beforehand, like the Stamp Act crisis, intolerable acts, that sort of thing, may be part of the 7 Years' War. You in that early part of, like I said, 1760s, even before the American Revolution, Boston Tea Party, you saw a development in political ideas of American history. That's when a lot of the founding fathers that we know today came into prominence, started making their arguments and writing their letters and their speeches and that sort of thing. And that's when you saw the global reach of the British Empire start to falter. And then, because they themselves sensed that they were going to falter, they started trying, sort of tamp down even harder, which eventually led to the American Revolution. The Stamp Act crisis, the intolerable acts, eventually led to Boston Tea Party, the American Revolution, Declaration of Independence, and the country that we know today. And then why it's important to study, I think, I'm a fan of that old adage of history never repeats itself, but it sure does rhyme. I see that I don't think I'm original in thinking this way, but I think that a lot of the problems that we're experiencing today, whether it be banking problems or anything like that, any of the political machinations of various individuals, we see that the founding fathers, I think, had an answer to most of those questions. I think that studying the foundational documents of our nation and of our founders would put us on a much different direction than where we are today. I don't know if we're going to get into discussing things like the history of impeachment or any of the other political history that we've previously discussed. But I think that there are a lot of things that we can learn from Thomas Jefferson and others like him, that would tell us or inform us better of where we're going and why we're on such a dangerous path, or try to avoid a dangerous path.
Fascinating. And during this period, of course, westward expansion was just starting to begin after the British, their proclamation line that they issued out just before the American Revolution, where no colonists or settlers were meant to go beyond the Appalachian Mountains, because that was designated for the indigenous nations that were there, and that was a treaty that the British created. Of course, that really doesn't stop people from exploring. And then after, of course, the British lose the American Revolution, that border is now open, and we now see westward expansion. But the first example of westward expansion isn't, of course, directly west. It's actually northwest, which is where the Ohio Valley is. And there was a lot of the beginnings of the initial conflicts, which, in doing my own research, there was actually one major battle that preceded General Custer's in terms of the biggest failure that the United States ever got dealt by the indigenous nations of the Ohio Valley, but it doesn't really get discussed a lot. So, Al, the discussion of the Ohio Valley and the beginnings of westward expansion, what can you tell us about that from your own research, and how does it sort of like have like this butterfly effect into what we would later see down the road with westward expansion across the rest of the United States?
Absolutely. No, and that's a fantastic question. And you're right, something that does not get covered very often. I would point to two battles of that era that really had an impact on westward expansion and opening of the Northwest Territories, which would have been pretty much anything west of the Ohio River and north of what we would call today Kentucky or Tennessee. So places Ohio, all of Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, most Illinois, all that area. And so those two battles are the Battle of the Wabash and the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Battle of the Wabash was fought in late 1791, and it was the greatest. It was part of America's first military operation, under the new Constitution, which had been signed only about 2 years earlier, and it was also it was also the greatest defeat that the American Army had faced going forward until another 100 years, until Custer's last stand, Battle of Little Bighorn. But I was actually, it's kind of interesting because I just read a book about this for a review for a journal of the American Revolution about the Battle of the Wabash. I would highly recommend the book. The soldiers fell like autumn leaves is the name of the book, which is a really good title. But other than that, it was a really good book too. Rick Schoenfield, I think, is his name. Anyways, he makes that argument too, and I think he's absolutely right that Battle of Little Bighorn is remembered, but not the Battle of the Wabash, and that's a really good question as to why. He doesn't get into it too much, but my thought process is, and I don't have the research to back it up, but this is maybe something that I will research in the future. Why is it that Battle of Little Bighorn is remembered instead of the Battle of the Wabash? The battle, and my thought process is because the Battle of Little Bighorn it has a heroic figure in Custer,
right?
Custer's last stand, and it is, whatever you want to say about the the mistreatment of Native Americans and the displacement from their lands, which is a horrible thing. You also, to some degree, have to admire Custer's idea of, we are going to fight to the last man, and he knew he was going to die. He shot his horse, his only means of escape, and he shot his horse to use it as cover because he was going to go down fighting, whatever you want to say, knowing you're going to die and making that conscious decision to go to your own end it's something at the very least. And so, like I said, my argument with that is that maybe if there was a Custer-like figure at the Battle of the Wabash, we might remember that battle more.
Interesting.
So the Wabash, it was fought along the Wabash River in Ohio. And it was a Continental Army of about 1,000 strong, led by Arthur St. Clair, who was handpicked by, at that time, President George Washington. He was handpicked to lead an expedition and secure that part of Ohio, southern part of Ohio, or south central part, and he failed miserably. The battles also, and to the Native Americans, they refer to the battle as St. Clair's defeat, and I think that is a much more accurate title for the battle too.
Right.
Because, like I say, he did fail spectacularly. He decided not to send scouting parties ahead to see where the Native Americans were moving. He did not set up a good supply chain, heading back east to D.C. and Virginia area to, make sure that he had enough ammunition and enough horses and food and that sort of thing. Like I say, I mean, it's hard to just pinpoint one fault factor,
right?
But ultimately, the way I look at it, he's the commander in chief. He's the boss. The buck stops with him. And it was like it was just a massacre. In all honesty, and he was fighting against a whole bunch of Native American tribes, another confederacy. So the Maumee Indians, the Miami, some Wyandot or Delaware Indians, Potawatomi, Chippewa, all groups of Indians, and they suffered some losses, of course, but nothing compared to the Continental Army. Of the 1,000 soldiers in the U.S. Army, I believe it's 24 of them or 26 of them escaped uninjured, or not captured, not killed, not scalped. So that's not a very good percentage point to argue for you. Obviously, that led to a massive retreat, and for a couple of years, some losses in land for the United States. For the most part, there weren't that many people in that part of the country at the time, so I'm not going to say it didn't matter, but the population affected was very small for the U.S. citizens at the very least. Once Arthur St. Clair got back from this failed expedition, there was a congressional inquiry into the matter. They exonerated him, but everybody, it was one of those things that sort of kept under their hat. We're not going to say you're guilty. We're not going to say it's your fault, but you should have done some things differently. And now we're just going to move on. And so ultimately, that is what happened, which then leads to the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which was 2 years later, which was fought in the northeast corner of Ohio, and led by Ed Anthony Wayne, also handpicked by George Washington, and a much more successful leader. They fought the same group of Indians, same confederacy, A lot of the same leaders, Blue Jacket, Little Turtle, Turkey Foot, a couple of these other individuals. Tecumseh was involved. He would become more important in the 1800s during Tecumseh's War and the War 1812, things like that. But the Battle of Fallen Timbers was actually pretty much the opposite of the Battle of the Wabash. Excuse me. Battle of Fallen Timbers was a massacre for the Native American forces. Again, they lost a lot of their soldiers, their braves, and their leaders. Turkey Foot died in that battle. Blue Jacket, I believe, was injured. A couple other important individuals, commanders, were injured or captured, even though they were actually during the Battle of Fallen Timbers, they were actually being supported by the British soldiers. There was a British command coming from Detroit, I believe it was, of British Rangers, I believe, to support the Native Americans, but they couldn't hold out against Anthony Wayne's superior organizational skills, logistical planning, and battlefield tactics. Just the pure strategy of it was much more thought out and much more practiced than anything the Native Americans had seen before. Because they had fought, they had fought at the Battle of Wabash, and they had, really routed the American forces. I'm not going to say they weren't expecting a tough, the same type of fight, but I don't think they were expecting that tough of a fight from Anthony Wayne, and ultimately that sort of led to their downfall.
Right.
And then ultimately, that's the Battle of the Fallen Timbers. A lot of historians argue is really what opened up the upper Midwest of the United States to colonization and westward expansion.
And I'm actually also glad you brought Tecumseh, because I feel he is an important figure during, as you say, the later half of the 18th century, but also became more prominent at the dawn of the 19th century, the 1800s. Now, there's been a discussion I've been seeing that has drawn a lot of inquiry, and I really want to hear your thoughts on this, Al. So the discussion I've been seeing is that, of course, during Tecumseh's War, there were opportunities for him to beat the United States and established, hypothetically, the Ohio Valley as an independent a Native American nation. That was ultimately his plan. But also in that discussion, some have argued that probably would have opened the doors for a pseudo-American Civil War early during the War of 1812, or even after 1820s, 1830s, possibly during the presidency of Andrew Jackson. I don't know if that would have been the case, but I would like to hear your thoughts on this topic, Al, about Tecumseh's War, and also, hypothetically, would it have been possible during the War of 1812 that he could have conquered the Ohio Valley and established it as an independent Native American nation, but also, more importantly, held onto it?
Sure. That is an interesting discussion, something I'm not familiar with, but it does sound very interesting, and I would like to read more about it, learn more about it. I'm not going to talk about maybe the speculation of, another sort of pseudo civil war or anything like that, or in during Jackson's presidency, just because I don't know anything about that. But I will say that I think that the possibility of Tecumseh and his brother, the Prophet, and some of those individuals uh, during the War 1812 or right before it. Uh, the possibility of them having their own nation was definitely a possibility. That was ultimately their goal, was to sort of stave off American expansion any farther west than it had already come, which at that point was still around the Ohio River, maybe a little bit west of there. And so that was definitely their goal. I mean, maybe it's not fair to say that's their goal to start a new nation per se, but I think it would have been. I think it was their goal to, hold on to what they had,
Right.
and not give up anymore. And during the war, 1812, and right before it, that was something that the British kind of promised to Tecumseh, was support for. The British were saying, if you help us reclaim our lost lands along the Atlantic coast, the United States of America, the 13 colonies, if you help us reclaim those lands, we'll let you have your own.
Right.
Like you mentioned earlier, the line of proclamation line. You cannot go any farther west. This was an often repeated promise of the British Crown or the British military. Obviously, it never materialized. Um, but I think that it would definitely have been a possibility for it. Ultimately, I think the biggest downfall would have been logistics for it. The British had no real good way to support the Native Americans west of the Appalachian Mountains, or the Ohio River. They had a few outposts in Detroit and uh, you know Mackinac Island and places like that, but they didn't have the kind of manpower or supply chain or anything like that you would need to stage a military operation like that.
Right.
And then, you know, um, I, 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 I think there was when the United States was founded, there was a unified vision of, well, I shouldn't say that, but there was a vision for what it would be beyond British rule. There were disagreements about uh, how it would differ from British rule or how it would be the same. But overall, everybody or most everybody agreed that we need to get out from under the British thumb. And while that same feeling was present in the Tecumseh's Federation, uh, in the 1810s or so, 1805 to hit the war, 1815, let's just say in those years, the to get out from underneath the Americans' thumb or to prevent American expansion, there wasn't a vision for how to unify the different tribes and the different geographic locations or different cross cultural lines or linguistic lines or anything like that. And so even if the even if they would have built their own nation, it's one of those things where I think the movement kind of died off when people like Tecumseh died and when his brother, the Prophet, died. They had a vision, but there weren't others to carry on the vision, which is different,
Okay.
like I said, than the United States, where there was a vision and it wasn't wrapped up in a single person or two people. The figurehead of the American Revolution in a lot of ways was George Washington. Uh, but as and it likely would have failed without him. But beyond the American Revolution, I don't know if he would have been necessary to continue on. You know what I mean? He was a great first president, and certainly an easy choice for president. He was uncontested, in the presidential election, the first one. But if he hadn't been the first president, probably somebody else could have been the first president and set up a good society for Americans. Maybe it would have been John Adams, maybe it would have been Alexander Hamilton. Somebody else would have set that up, and would have been successful. Like I say, with Tecumseh and with that Confederacy, he was the figurehead and he was the only one. There was nobody to replace him.
Right. And I'm actually glad that's a little tangent where you talk about George Washington. I had a friend of mine who I was chatting with, another fellow American historian, who said that if it wasn't Washington who would later become the United States' first president, in her research, it would have been the Sons of Liberty leader, Dr. Joseph Warren, who died at the Battle of Bunker Hill.
Yeah.
And in her research, if he did not die and he went through the rest of the war, he probably would have been another great contender for presidency and possibly would have been the first president. But absolutely what you said, that these powerful men have these visions of what they hope for their people to be the best life. And as opposed to the Confederacy, where it's only him and his brother, the prophet, who had the vision, there was no other people that they had trained to continue the vision, as opposed to the United States, where it had, rest of the founding fathers and their children and their successors who would continue the dream. And let's actually talk about westward expansion, because I definitely feel when we think of westward expansion, it's like, oh, it just sort of came about like after the American Revolution, the beginning of the 1800s. But I think there's more to it. As you said, Al, just recently, that the 13 colonies wanted to break away from the British yoke. They want to move beyond their borders. Now, in your research, tying it back to the relations with the indigenous people of the Midwest, or the beginnings of the Midwest, how did that discussion come about in your research? And was there anything that sort of broke, again, the myths about westward expansion, manifest destiny?
Yeah. Well, I think you hit the nail on the head right there, where you said that, westward expansion, what we now call manifest destiny, it wasn't a term then. There's that idea in our heads that it started after with the opening of the West, what we call, the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains and things like that.
Right.
But no, really, the westward expansion started, decades before that. And it's something that's never talked about. It was actually really fun. One of the things that I recently was able to work on was, I believe you mentioned it earlier, an article for I had published with the Journal of the American Revolution, the Legend of McCullough's Leap.
Yes.
And that was a really interesting piece to work out. There are a lot of, this is kind of where the myths kind of become history, because there were few sources available. I did what I could with it. Aside from the myth of westward expansion only started after the American Revolution, there's the myth in that article about Colonel Samuel McCullough, or I'm sorry, Major Samuel McCullough, who rode to the rescue of a fort under siege. This was Fort Henry, uh, just outside of Pittsburgh today. So not far west in what we would describe it, but
Right.
pretty far west for how the people in 1775,
Mm-hmm.
1780 describe it. That's 200 miles from the coast or so. That's a long ways west.
Yes.
I mean, uh, so you can already see how some of those uh, that idea of westward expansion had already come about uh, like I say, in the 1770s during the American Revolution. But anyways, so uh, that's a really good point to have made is that westward expansion has been a part of our history pretty much from the beginning, uh, and it's not to you know discount the explorations elsewhere, but ultimately heading west is what got us to North America in the first place. When we go back to Christopher Columbus, you know what I mean, and others before him.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so like I said, that idea of Western expansion or Western exploration really has been a foundational part of American history. Uh, and I say that not just in terms of the United States history, but Canadian history or Mexican history, Brazilian
Right.
history, the history of the Americas, both continents,
Mm.
has been really a focus of um, westward expansion.
Definitely. And nearing the, or almost nearing the end, but I feel there's a last few questions I do want to run by you, Al. Now, the early Republic period, as you've researched and dived into the most, was really more like the testing ground for the United States to exist as a nation on the world stage. There were, I'm sure you definitely agree in your research, there were moments where the United States nearly collapsed numerous times, but somehow they didn't. So, as a little tangent away from the indigenous nations relations with the early Republic period, which were another big contender, were there any other aspects during the early Republic period that could have greatly fractured the nation as a whole, but thankfully didn't?
Yeah, I mean there were a few uh, that were. I don't know if they would have fractured the nation. It might have maybe been just certain pockets of the nation, but things like the Whiskey Rebellion,
Mm-hmm.
uh, things like that. In the late 1790s, uh, there was the it was never really called this, and it's not the greatest way to describe it. But the only way I have, at least at the moment, to describe it, sort of the first uh, nullification crisis. Nullification has its own meaning later on in the
Mm-hmm.
1820s, 30s, 40s, and beyond that into the Civil War. But like I said, there was kind of a nullification crisis in the 1790s. Um, Ultimately, most of them were were actually repaired by um, figureheads that we know today, people like George Washington, and during the 1790s, late 1790s, Patrick Henry uh, had a came back from uh, his plantation and spoke out against the idea of nullification and the idea of the anti-federalist sentiment of that day, even though he himself was an anti-federalist, he felt that, you know, he didn't support the Constitution of the United States, and he didn't support or when it was initially drafted, when it was initially proposed, he didn't really support it, and when he didn't really support the idea of federalism. He was a very much so a states' rights person, you know, a loose confederation. But ultimately, he's also the one who, you know, during this nullification crisis, bucked his own party. You know, people like James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, and said, "I don't agree with the Constitution, but it is the highest law of the land, and that is what we must follow, because that is what, you know, that was the will of the people. That was what we agreed to follow. We can find ways to fight it, to make these arguments constitutionally, but we cannot just go outside of the Constitution and start making up our own rules, like nullification would have done, and did do, you know, decades later. You know, we need to find ways to make it work within the confines of the Constitution." And so I think that's really speaking to not just a singular person who helped keep things together, but also a vision for the United States. You know, there was that rule of law and that respect for the Constitution, and that even though that idea that even though I don't agree with you or with your ideas or your ideology, I'm going to work with you to make a compromise, or to fight against it in a constitutional, I think he called it the constitutional way, you know, you know, and I think that that's something that really speaks to, again, the founding fathers and the, you know, impact that they had, going so far as into today too. Is like, you know, we need to have a way to not, you know, forego the Constitution, not terminate it, not move aside from it, but work within those confines to come to a peaceful resolution for everybody.
Well said, Al. Well said. And sort of like the final discussion for this great topic, which I've learned so much about, like the early Republic period, which I think no one really talks about it as much. We tend to think of the American Revolution.
Yeah.
But then we just breeze through the late 1780s and 1790s. Yeah. Go to the War of 1812, the U.S.-Mexican War, the Civil War, and that's it. But for you, Al, and researching this topic, which I can clearly see from your website and the books you've read and done reviews for and articles, you're very, very passionate about bringing American history to the forefront. And ultimately, almost like a reflection question, how different do you think your life would be if you were not bringing to life the America's past to a new generation of historians?
Yeah, I know I would be less informed, obviously, you know, and less aware of what the things happening, you know, in today's world. You know, I feel as though we'll have to come back. We'll have to have another discussion at some point about American political history in this era.
Definitely.
But, you know, and connecting it maybe even to today. But regardless of that, you know, like I said, you know, I would read the news today and I would, you know, just sort of pass it off as, oh, okay, well, that's just what's happening. Whereas now you know, today when I read the news, and then with the knowledge base that I do have, well, I see that, oh no, you know, this has happened. This hasn't happened before, but something similar to it has happened before. You know, and so now I can think, well, how did XYZ handle this problem 100 years ago, 200 years ago, whatever it is? You know, is that methodology applicable today? I don't know, but it's a point of discussion. It's a point of, like you said, personal reflection. And ultimately, that's what I really like to do. Is I like to find ways that, um, you know, our history can still speak to our present and to our future. And I know that maybe it sounds a little bit cheesy, and it probably is, but ultimately, like I said, I think that the other old adage, and again, being cheesy again, but I am from Wisconsin, so why not? The old adage of those who don't know their history are bound to repeat it, I think is true. And I think we see that every day across the world in a lot of different aspects, across political ideologies or governmental affairs or anything like that. I think that there's a lot to be learned from history. And so I think it's great that in recent years, especially, I've noticed an uptick in resources for it, whether it's this podcast, whether it's one other one of your guests, Courtney Atkins's magazine, The Hellfighter.
Yeah.
The I can't remember the guest you had on the last couple of months who talked about Joseph Warren and dying at the Battle of Bunker Hill. I can't remember her name now off the top of my head, but she has
Lisa Weekland.
Yeah, Lisa Weekland. Yes, thank you. Yeah, her YouTube channel which talks about a lot of the same things that I'm interested in. And there's just so many free resources out there. Journal of the American Revolution, History News Network, that are all really, really valuable and easily accessible and can teach people a lot. And like I say, and I've spent a lot of my time, maybe more than I should, but I don't think so, working with these resources and learning from them. And so how different would my life be? Well, like I said, I think I would be less informed, and I think I would be more boring.
You know what? I 100% agree with everything you just said. And also, thank you for the name drops of those people, because I'm sure they're going to get a kick out of this when this releases. But I have no more words to say, because this has probably been an amazing discussion of American history. You know what? I may just have to do a separate channel of yours, or a separate playlist of history of the United States, because this has been so incredible. I've learned so much from our today's guest, Al Dickenson, and also shout out to Lisa Weekland of her podcast, and also to Jake Suggs, who I interviewed a few months ago, who's also very patriotic of American and U.S. history. So shout out to him as well, and all the other historians who I've had featured on the channel. And now we've arrived at the end of this amazing discussion here on the channel. I want to give a huge thank you to Al for coming out on the show and making his debut here on the channel. But I feel this will not be the last time we will see Al on the channel. Who knows? We may have him back on for his own historian interview to tell us more about what drew him to history and what he's been working on. But we'll have to wait and see. But thank you again so much, viewers and listeners, for coming on today and enjoying the content. Again, a huge thank you to Al for coming on the show. And before we end, Al, are there any announcements you want to make? Any projects you're working on, book reviews, any episodes on your YouTube channel you would like to showcase?
Yeah, I just released another YouTube video yesterday, or no, earlier today actually. Sorry, about Stephen Crane's poetry. So go check that out. A few other projects to work on, but you can find them either on my website or LinkedIn or something along those lines. So otherwise, this has been great. I really appreciate you having me on, and it's a great host. So I look forward to returning it and or seeing who else you have on the podcast as we go.
Thank you, Al. That really means a lot. I will link all of that down below in the description of this video. Please go and subscribe to Al's channel, which again I will provide down below, as well as follow him on LinkedIn to be up to date with all of his ventures and projects. And I urge you all to go check out his website to learn more about the reviews he's done for the Journal of the what was the journal's name again, Al?
Journal of the American Revolution, and I have two reviews coming out with them in the next couple of months. So.
Awesome. So I'll make sure to link that down below as well. Thank you again so very much, viewers and listeners, for your love and support. Again, thank you to now we're 108 subscribers here on the channel. That's incredible. Now 140 with the release of this episode, 143 videos in a year and a half now, which is incredible. But I'm not done yet. I have 2 final interviews coming up tomorrow. So be on the lookout for that. And with that, viewers and listeners, make sure to like and subscribe and comment down below what was your favorite part about today's discussion. And until next time, this has been the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out and wishing you a wonderful day.